Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a new week. And this one will set the cat among the pigeons. Caen, Monty, promises, objectives. A lot has been written and discussed about Montgomery's Normandy campaign. Andrew Harrison's interpretations can be found in his book, Caen, Cobra and Confusion. The links to buying it are in the description below. And I'll bring Andrew in and we'll start a discussion. So good evening, sir. How are you today?
I'm all right. Thank you very much. Yourself, Paul?
I'm good. So, people are already in the sidebar waiting for a bit of a kind of not controversial, but some real stimulating conversation, because you can't mention Montgomery without people chirping in and saying he's the best general ever or he's the worst general ever. And that's the thing about all of these figures: Montgomery, MacArthur, Patton. People tend to not want to change their mind. If they think he's great, they will continue to think he's great. If they think he's awful, they will continue to think that. So before we get into the conversation, what prompted you to kind of take on a subject that is going to endear you to lots of people, and other people will think you're the worst person ever? So what prompted you to do it?
I know. When you mentioned Monty, you said he's either good or bad. It's a bit like chumming the water, isn't it, for sharks? You put your opinions in, and the sharks turn up. It just struck me that Monty was when I did that. It was only a couple of 3 years ago now when I first started looking at Monty for my master's degree. Monty was going through a tiny bit of a resurgence, but he was mostly still in the dumps and the doldrums. And it struck me that why was it that a person who managed to lead the Allies to victory in Normandy was still so much of a Marmite sort of person? We got so many big bats and amongst everything else. So you can't. Not everyone can be right, and not everyone can be wrong. But there was a certain lack of nuance, and I was hoping, rather than just to troll through another presentation about D-Day or the Normandy thing as a whole, to try and examine certain key aspects of the Normandy campaign and see if what has been written before really was the definitive last word, or whether or not there was some more nuance to be added to it. And I think hopefully I've done that with my work. If I can maybe just add, maybe make people think again. As you said, no one's going to ever be convinced that Monty was brilliant, but or vice versa. But that was the intention anyway.
But that is, before we get into the conversation, that is the thing. He did lead a successful campaign. Whether you hate him or like him, is that the maths is there. The campaign came out in fewer days than that had been projected, with probably fewer casualties than had been anticipated, and the German army was pretty much defeated. So I mean, in that sense, if you've won the FA Cup, you've won the FA Cup. Maybe you had a wobble at the semi-final, but you've still won the cup. But what we're going to do in terms of questions is, I feel we're going to do the majority of the questions, folks, at the end of the show, because I feel if we don't, we'll end up not getting beyond slide 3, because it'll all just kick off and we'll all start having conversations. That doesn't mean you can't fire away with the comments, and we may address some of them as we go along, but I think the majority will leave to the end. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Andrew, but I will be jumping back and forth and bouncing ideas off you. So over to you, sir.
All righty. So, evening, everyone. So I called my work Caen, Cobra and Confusion because basically there was an awful lot of confusion, I think, that swirled around Normandy and the planning for and the actual operations that were made up Normandy. Sorry, I'm stuttering a little bit here. And it strikes me that it was almost as if the thunderclap presentations never happened. It was Monty went through his spiel, and others as well, and he let them talk as well. He was very much let the Navy and the Air Force people say their thing as well, because it was a team effort. But somehow or other, what has been said in Thunderclap seemed to go out of the window fairly quickly, and I love that. If you look at the previous photo. You see Tedder behind. I mean, this was taken in a meeting in Maastricht a couple of weeks before the Bulge, But look at Tedder's face. He just given the side eye there. He just can't stand Monty. I mean, I know Tedder didn't like many people from the army, whether it be British, Canadian, or American, but he really did not like Monty, and Monty didn't give a hoot either. But we'll touch on this further on. But I just think that many of the bullets that Monty had fired at him were produced by Monty as well. So and Tedder was not one to let sleeping dogs lie, and as you can see there, Brad.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, Andrew, with a lot of these figures, with Patton and MacArthur, is that they end up getting beaten with their own stick, don't they? That's they're not necessarily the most people-oriented people. They sometimes say things without necessarily having thought it all out fully, and you think, oh God, I know what you mean there, but you could have worded that in a slightly less arrogant way or slightly less self-aggrandizing kind of way. So they are interesting figures, and I think that's why some of the ones who are a little bit more passive we don't discuss as much, because they did let their battlefield performance, if you like, dictate what people thought about them. But people like Montgomery were always happy to say something, I guess.
Yes, and he was just unique in amongst all these people who thought very much of lots about themselves, but he couldn't read a room to save his life. That's the thing. I mean, how he got as far as he did, even before the advent of the Second World War, is a mystery, because as I say, if you lock Montgomery in a room with a cheese plant on their own, then within a very short time the cheese plant's going to end up on the floor. It will throw itself off the stand. So, but yes, I look what you said about people not being quite so loquacious about themselves. There's in this photograph, it's just been cut out there. There's a Simpson of 9th US Army, and he was such an underrated general. And
I love Simpson. I love Simpson.
One that Monty thought a lot of, and he really tore. I mean, apart from the fact that it removed several opportunities for Monty, he really missed the fact that he and Simpson weren't going to be able to work together anymore from something like March 45 onwards. So yeah, you're right that the people who banged the drum the loudest seem to get remembered for whatever reason.
So before we bring a second slide, when it comes to Montgomery, there are kind of three sets of things he said, aren't there, for everything? There's the things he said before they happened, the things he said as and during their happening, and then the things he said afterwards, sometimes years, even decades later. And so just before, in the research process, how much does the stuff he said before, the stuff he said during, and the stuff he said afterwards tally up with each other? I mean, is it because he is accused of kind of moving the goalposts a bit, isn't he?
He is, but I think I personally think that the stuff he said prior to Thunderclap and in Thunderclap, it works out as things unfolded. There's Monty. That's September 44, giving the king the benefit of his advice there. I think if you look at them, and if you can put Monty's abrasive personality to one side, and the fact that he annoyed so many people, I think that what Monty said actually he was going to do, he actually did. It's just the way he went about it. Saying, I mean, a good example of that is Goodwood. I know we're going to touch on that slightly as we come across. But what possessed him to put out that sit-rep report on the evening of Goodwood's opening day, when it didn't, it's talking about setting up expectations to reality. Why he said that, I do not know. It's just, but I think Monty sometimes was one of those people who had to, as he said, had to say something rather than nothing, and so he would big up an opportunity. But I think to answer your question, with regards to Normandy, he what he said, what he printed on the tin, pretty much was what happened. It's just he managed to annoy so many people in the process, and also it has to be said as well that not everything that affects Monty's reputation actually happened on the battlefield. It happened years later, and with that silly spat he had between him and Eisenhower and Bradley. When the Bradley thing started, Bradley's I always think he's quite an interesting character, because prior to the end of the Normandy campaign, despite all the hoo-ha that he's written in the studies post-war, Bradley and Monty got on quite well. Bradley seemed to understand the idea of the British Canadians. I know we'll touch on this later. He seemed to understand what Monty was trying to achieve. It wasn't until later on in the war, especially around Eisenhower's decision to put Monty in charge of some of the units under Bradley's command. I think that's when the rot set in seriously. But at the time of Normandy, I think they got on, if not like a house on fire, at least they understood each other well enough. So that's what I think.
No, fair enough. And tell me when you want me to nudge on the slides. And
okay. Well, I would say, well, the Monty method of planning, there wasn't really a Monty method per se. I don't think he famously said, I mean, these days he'd be held up as a quite a forward and revolutionary thinker. He said, I read no paper. If someone's got a problem, if someone's got an issue, I'm paraphrasing here, that I prefer them to pick up the phone or come and see me directly. And I think that was pretty much the Monty style of things. He would set out the broad picture and then let other people fill in the blanks, so to speak. And I think he was very unfair to the Cossack planners. Prior to, I mean, there's that famous thing when he looked at their plan and he said, "Oh, it just won't do." And the more I looked at it, the more I became convinced that it was a poor plan. But then again, so did Morgan. He thought it was a poor plan as well. He only had 3 divisions and 1 airborne. He knew it wasn't enough, but he wasn't able to sequester any more, and he knew he wouldn't under his own. Remember, at the time of Cossack, there was no supreme commander at all. Yeah. He was just as to what Brooke had told him, it won't work, but you've got to make it work, sort of thing. So I think the Monty method of planning was sort of, here's what we need to do. I'll ultimately be responsible for it. And that doesn't mean to say that everything that happened, was somebody else's fault, because Monty had to present that plan, and he had to say that this is what we're going to do. There's no bellyaching was one of his famous things, and he also said as well that American doctrine will be their own, and General Bradley will act as he sees fit. And I think he recognised the value of good staff work and letting people have their head, but ultimately it was he that carried the can. So I think you have to bear that in mind when you say the Monty plan. It was a plan of many parts, sort of thing, and to which Monty ultimately put his name to. And if he wasn't happy to it, he wouldn't have put his name to it at all. But we're going to go on to a little bit about Caen, I know, but I think the problem with Monty was once the plan was presented, then he would stick to it come hell or high water, or he would let people think what they wanted to think as long as it suited Monty for them to think it. But he wouldn't ever go back and say, well, actually, this is what we intended, but this isn't going to happen, so we'll do this. But it's all going to add to the plan. And so that's basically the Monty method of planning. I think it was a sum of its parts. He read no paper, and I think he relied possibly too much on his chief of staff, Freddie de Guingamp. But Freddie was happy to be Monty's right hand man. But I think it's interesting to note that when Freddie wasn't, because Freddie got quite poorly over the course of the campaign generally, not just Normandy. I think when Freddie was poorly, Monty suffered accordingly, because Freddie was the sort of the airlock between Monty and people around him. And I think you can tell when Freddie was not on his top of his form, then nor was Monty either.
It's interesting you said about he's pretty much a kind of a stick to what he intended type person. He doesn't just get halfway through an operation and go, actually, we're going to change tack completely at the halftime team talk and do something completely different in the second half. He kind of sticks with what his vision is. But that, I always think that's essentially the way the Allies won the World War II, in that you see it with aircraft design, tank design, doctrine, is that at no point does anything get completely thrown away. We don't throw the baby away with the bathwater. We say, okay, this particular tank or aircraft is not quite working yet. Look at the the Lancaster coming out of the twin engine version, the Manchester. It's like we didn't say, okay, give up then, forget this. Let's just go back to the drawing board completely. The Lancaster evolved out of a previous incarnation. So I think he's really only doing it the Allied way. Is you've got a basic method, and we're going to make that method work by refining. It's revolution, it's evolution, not revolution. Would you think that applies to him in some ways?
I think he very much so. But if he pushed, he could change a plan. I mean, look, El Alamein is a good example of that.
Yeah.
know, supercharge halfway through when it was apparent that they weren't going to get through the minefields as quickly or as effectively as Lightfoot. Imagine. So he didn't go back to the drawing board, but he did improve it with supercharge, and the rest is history, sort of thing. So he didn't just patter through all the time. He could recognise when something wasn't working as planned, and I think the thing to bear in mind with Monty as well is, following on from things like El Alamein, he realised that essentially the British Army was a wasting asset. I think he was familiar with. I think he was aware of that from a very early on period. You only had a finite amount of men, unlike the Americans. And I'm not saying the Americans were frivolous with their men's lives either. It's just that Monty knew that by the time of Normandy and Northern, that was it from the British Army point of view. There wasn't very much more in the pot. I mean, regardless of what Carlo d'Este said, there wasn't 100,000 people sat around doing nothing back in the UK. But Monty, there was a reason why divisions had to be broken up as the campaign went on, because, and I think Monty recognised that, and he acted accordingly.
Yeah, and that ties in with what Nicholas Moss said. And by the way, folks, I am saving lots of your questions for later on. So he said, by 44, the Brits had no replacements, having lost 800,000 dead and 2 million injured 20 years early in World War I. He knew this. I mean, he's out, and David O'Keefe said it about the last 100 days of the First War. He's absolutely bringing his First World War experience and First World War understanding of casualty rates to his thinking. You can't, and when Phil McCarthy will be on tomorrow, was talking about the 1940 brigadiers, the percentage that had been subalterns in the First World War who are now brigadiers in 1940, it was massive. And so he's definitely coming at the whole war from a First World War, you only have finite resources perspective.
Yeah. And I think that shows in Monty's own experience. Yeah, you can see, yes, obviously the Great War and the Second World War, in particular Normandy, like we're talking about here, they're not exactly a uniform fit, but there are elements of that. And Monty knew the value of life and the fact that, I mean, Horrocks said it best, didn't he? And said in a group of 10 people, 10 ordinary soldiers, as opposed to like people like the airborne or whatnot, but 7 people would follow. One person would wish he was virtually anywhere else, and the other 2 would do the leading. And Monty knew that, and he understood the men he was leading, and whether that be Canadian or British or even the Americans. I mean, I think he recognised. John Buckley put it best, I think, when he wrote his book about Monty's men. I think basically it boiled down to whichever country you came from, certainly for the way that Normandy was fought, I think they were all Monty's men, and he wanted to save as many people as he could and get them back home after it all finished. So that's
Well, we will move on. So here's the first the first thing. Caen, June the 6th, D-Day objective. People have said it is, it isn't, it was, it wasn't. What does he mean by Caen? Over to you for your interpretation, sir.
I think Caen was an aspiration. It was a. If you look at the way he when he wrote his paper, Some Army Problems, I've seen the handwritten copy, the originals at the Imperial War Museum, and I've seen the typed up versions at Kew. And it's interesting that he underlines both sets. We must get ashore. Ultimately, we must get ashore was the be all and end all. It was the be all and end all to start off with, but I think he was eager to avoid Anzio. I think that was in the back of his mind as well. He sent a copy of the same paper to Churchill, and Churchill sent it back with a modern day, an old fashioned version of the post-it note, saying something along the lines of, "It's a pity that the people at Anzio didn't follow the same." So you have the same mindset as yourself. Again, I'm paraphrasing that, but I think getting ashore on its own was important, because let's face it, if the invasion failed, then that was probably going to be the end of Germany first. Regardless of what Roosevelt said, it would have been the American people would have wanted to go back to the Pacific and sort out the Japanese rather than go back to Europe again. But I think getting ashore wasn't the be all and end all to Monty, despite his underlining of the thing. He had to give them a task over and above getting ashore, and Caen was very much an aspiration. Had Third British Infantry Division got to Caen, then great, he'd have taken the plaudits. Sure, he sure would. But you had to say there's more to this than getting ashore. And I think Caen was and again, that is something that came back to beat him, though. You see it again and again and again. I mean, I've been swatting up for this talk over the last few days, as you can imagine, and again and again and again, you see the same thing. Oh, it was a task beyond the men given it. I think he's probably right. He probably was a task beyond it. You think about it, Caen was 8 to 9 miles, depending how you measure it from Sword. You know, Sword was the smallest beach of all of the 5. You can only get one brigade ashore at a time. It's just, I think Caen was an aspiration. And I think that going back to what we were talking about earlier about the Monty plan, it's interesting that I thought it was interesting anyway that. The order from Second British Army to First Corps will capture Caen, D-Day. So that's fairly clear. And then First Corps orders to Third British Infantry Division was by the end of D-Day, Caen will be captured or effectively masked. Now, you can't tell me that Monty, de Wingan, wouldn't have read that and in turn made Monty aware. Now, that's not just hair splitting. That is pragmatism of the First Order, and that order goes on to say that brigade locations must be firmly established, and that's the same way as Monty's saying we must peg out claims well inland. And I think the two mesh perfectly there. I don't think there's any real difference between First Corps orders to Third British Infantry Division and Monty's instructions to Second Army. I think the two match perfectly.
I mean, when I in my touring days, and Colin Taylor, my best mate, is watching. When Americans, and it is particularly Americans who tend to bring out the "I will beat Monty with a stick" comments. You know, Brits tend to be more tolerant, but Americans say, "Well, he didn't get to Caen." My first response to that is, "What do you mean by Caen? You know, what is your definition of getting to Caen?" Because for my interpretation, getting to the northern outskirts of Caen doesn't particularly help anything. And definitely British and Canadian troops had got within spitting distance of the northern suburbs of Caen. I don't think it either means getting into the city centre near the Abbey aux Dames and Abbey aux Hommes. I don't think it really means that either. I think it really means getting to the high ground beyond Caen. I mean, that's what I think it should mean in terms of us understanding what's your interpretation of what is even meant by getting to Caen?
I think Caen was one of those getting to Caen, and had they got to Caen, that would have given them an awful lot more room to establish airfields and airstrips and whatnot. And I think that was at the back of his mind. It wasn't so much tank country at that stage. It was getting people ashore to establish airstrips and to get them up and running. And I think one of the things, and again, we're going to touch on this a bit later, so I don't use all my powder. But I think Monty understood the value of air power, even though people like Tedder and Conningham thought that they were shortchanged after El Alamein and so on and so forth. But I think he generally thought that the more but he said it so in his orders, as we get more land, then we have more airstrips, and everything gets easier as a result. And I think that was his overriding thing. But I think tank room for manoeuvre was one thing. I think airstrip was the primary goal there. And also, I think if you think of go back to it sounds like we'll pick on our American cousins, but I think if you look at D-Day as a whole, and the first couple of days are D plus 1, 2, 3, really no real apart from getting ashore and staying ashore and repulsing what the Germans' attempts to roll up the front, nothing really that were set down as D-Day goals and aspirations was reached. I mean, Bayeux took a day or two later. You think about Cherbourg, that was supposed to fall within 2 weeks. It didn't. There's all those things. It had to be more. I think the Ghost of Anzio was very much in the background, and likewise Gallipoli. It was all very well to get ashore, but you had to do something more once you were ashore. And it's no good resting on your laurels. You know, it's going to take us 18 months to do all this. But let's not just get onto shore and then dig in, because that's just no good. You're going to play to the strengths of the Germans there. So I think Caen was very much an aspiration, and it's one I don't think it was ever really intended to be so. But you know, it's come back to haunt Monty almost from the get-go.
Absolutely. And I'll just add David O'Keefe's comment there. The esteemed Mr. O'Keefe over in Canada, no, they were looking at getting Verrières, which is a natural defensive position south of Caen, but again, aspirational. So not surprising you mentioned Verrières Ridge there, David. I'm surprised you haven't mentioned Ultra yet, but I'm sure that will come up later on. I think it's interesting as well, Andrew, that we think of Caen and we think of the city, but with Saint-Lô, which is I know you'll be mentioning that later on. Saint-Lô, I think of as a broader campaign beyond just the city itself, and I think you could easily interpret the wooded area northeast of Caen, the Breville Wood, where the 6th Airborne, the commandos were. You could include that as part of the Caen wider battle, and that was successfully taken on June the 6th, and they held that high ground for the next 3 months. So part of what I would include Caen was absolutely taken on June the 6th. No, the city itself was, and I think we're going to get into this later on, I'm sure, Andrew. It's all about language and intentions, and I think we're in agreement mostly about it being aspirational. There's lots of questions building up later on, so we'll keep on playing through this. I knew there'd be lots of comments coming, and it is. I think we've got the most live views we've had for a couple of weeks, the most questions we have coming in for a couple of weeks. So I'm gonna hand it back to you, Andrew. Let's try and plow on through this. It's fantastic stuff.
I think very quickly, but going back to Caen, I think if Caen had been taken D+1, 2, 3, I think it would have been, if not disastrous for the Allies, I think it would have come back to haunt them. I think you wouldn't have gotten enough stuff off the beach to Caen proper, you know, to the outskirts of Caen. I think 21st Panzer would have rolled them back. There just wasn't enough there. If you look at the actual the forces deployed by 3rd British Division to get from Sword and the soldiers and the units that tried to get to Caen, it was woefully inadequate. It was barely one battalion with one company up front to get all the way from Sword to Caen. Had they got there, they'd have ended up with egg on their faces.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not even, I mean, we're going to get into Germans now. That's not even really considering the fact 21st Panzer are on the loose and 12th SS are on their way up there, and not including the particularly formidable inland fixed positions of, you know, Morris and Hillman and the radar station at Douvres-Livrande, all those positions there that in some ways had been underappreciated. But let's deal with this slide now, and it's because I can't wait to hear your views.
Well, the myth of German superiority. I mean, I think I'm going to go slightly back to front here, because I think the thing to point out is the Germans were no more successful on the offensive than the Allies were in the barrage and the built-up areas. When it boiled down to it, this all this experience that they built up on the Eastern Front, and they came to the Western Front thinking that you know, they'd beaten Ivan, or well, they hadn't beaten Ivan, had they? But you know, they were vastly superior on a person-to-person basis, on a tank unit basis. You know, I think they came with expectations that just did not match the realities on the ground. I mean, Rommel said it best to Fritz Behling. You know, this is not just, we're not talking about mindless hordes attacking willy-nilly. Well, he didn't say willy-nilly, but well, I'm paraphrasing again. We're not just thinking about mindless hordes. We are dealing here with an enemy who will use his tactical guile to the best of his ability, and I think everything that was experienced on the Eastern Front just wasn't transferable, really. In that manner. So you got old Rundstedt there, and you got Kurt Meyer and old Sepp Dietrich. They were very much used to, and they all had experience on the Eastern Front. They were brawlers when it came to it. They expected the Americans, the Canadians, the British to play to their tune.
Yeah.
and they were. I don't think they knew how to. I mean, experience. Was talking. I mentioned the Eastern Front. The sort of air power that they were exposed to in Normandy and Northwest Europe generally was in no way comparable to the sort of thing they were used to and dealt with on the Eastern Front. Now, I'm not saying that the Russian Air Force was useless or anything like that. I'm certainly not saying that. But the way that that things like cab ranks and the American versions of things were, the amount of heavy firepower that was released on the Germans in operations like Charnwood and Cobra, it's the sort of thing that was never ever anticipated by the Germans, and they had no answer to it. I mean, it wasn't all about air power, obviously, but at the end of the day, the Germans, the myth of the Whitman myth is another one of those things. Villers Bocage. Let's face it, impressive up to a point. But that was also down to Seventh Armored not doing what it should have done as well. So we fought to the German strengths instead of vice versa. And then when the Germans did, I mean, tactically and doctrinally, what were the Germans taught to do to counterattack as soon as the position was lost? Almost Pavlovian in that respect, and that worked to a greater or lesser extent on the Russian front. Obviously, as the Russians got more used to fighting the Germans, it got less and less effective. But it was still the way that Germans did things, and it's the way they did things in Normandy. But as soon as they counterattacked, then they were hammered by artillery, both offshore and onshore. It just the Germans fought to our strengths, and sometimes we fought to the German strengths. But at the end of the day, the British, Canadians, and Americans, they learnt on the hoof. The Germans were very much one-trick ponies, and they stuck to that doctrine. And I think it showed.
And just to bounce off your comparison to the Eastern Front, is I think some of us are also guilty of thinking that because Overlord got the invasion force across the Channel on June the 6th, that the Channel is still not actually affecting things, but it's going to be affecting things for the build-up for the next few months, because all the next divisions will have to come over the Channel. All the logistics, all the ammunition, all the trucks, all the bullets, all the bandages will all have to come over the Channel there. And just because you've got over it successfully on that first day doesn't mean it's still an obstacle. Whereas the Eastern Front, to some extent, there are lots of river valleys and things to cross there, but the Channel was still an issue. And Montgomery is aware, and James Holland talks about this, of the need to bring over big war. And big war means, having plenty of ammunition, plenty of tank repair parks, plenty of resources, so that when you move forward and deal the killer blow can be backed up by that amount of reinforcement. So I think maybe the Germans were expecting the Allies to be a bit more dynamic in those first few days after the invasion, but we've got to wait to bring across our assets. That's a fair point, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very much a fair point. I mean, the logistics to the German army, I'm probably going to get shot for this because I'm being very, very general here, but it was almost that was almost aspirational in some ways. Logistics it was just as there's a famous story, isn't there, of Churchill talking to Brooke and saying, well, I can't remember which army was talking about. They have 50,000 people on strength, and he didn't understand that 50,000 people on strength didn't mean that there's 50,000 people on the front line. You had to have the follow-on forces. You had to have people. You had to have the ammunition. You had to have all the supplies and all of the follow-on stuff coming ashore to support those 50,000 people, of which only 20,000 people would be at the front sharp end. Yeah. I think that's very much the thing that the Germans didn't really appreciate. They sort of had this idea that, and Hitler certainly did, of. And they were the more you read about it, and it sounds as if we're giving the German officers a get out of jail free card here. We're doing a von Manstein with his lost victories, but they were so totally enthralled to Hitler that I'm not saying that had they had their heads, then Normandy and Overlord would have been defeated, because it wouldn't have been, but it would have gone so much harder for the Allies. But because they were so enthralled to Adolf, they they were like Pavlov's dogs themselves. They you know, as Rundstedt said, you know, the only thing I can do is to change the guards in front of my gate. They had no real expectation, regardless of what of their planning and their potential, to exercise any of that potential. And I think that hobbled them almost from the get-go as well. They knew that they should do certain things. I mean, they famously von Rundstedt and Rommel asked to pull far enough back so they'd be out of range of the Allied fleet. Wouldn't allow that to happen, you know, sort of thing. So I think, but yes, to go back to your original thing, big war was a big thing for the Allies, and in a way that it just wasn't for the Germans, and they were never going to win. Even if it would have gone slightly harder in the initial few days for the Allies, but they were like the original headless chickens. They couldn't see the wood for the trees, and those that could, you know, weren't allowed to say anything.
And that, you know, that, and the disadvantage of having plenty of artillery, for example, for the Allies, is the fact that you will need plenty of ammunition of that artillery, and that's when we end up discussing the Red Army's artillery, as we did a famous presentation with Sasho a few years ago. It's and he would refer to it as the bandwidth. It's not the barrels. It's the how many rounds you're putting through the barrels that counts. And you can look at how many guns the Americans have or the Soviets have at any one point, but it's how much stuff you got to fire through it. How many spare parts have you got? So it's yeah, I mean, the questions are flying in again. And with that idea about the logistics, ENT said, didn't the Americans have issue with artillery supplies, delaying attacks, causing a 21st Summer Group to keep pressure up on their side of the bridgehead? Yeah, I mean, there are issues with logistics all the way through. And then let's throw the Great Storm into the mix as well. You know, the storm that effectively stops supplies for a week or so, and it takes Allies almost like 3 or 4 weeks beyond that to get to the point where they're back at an even keel. So that's something to consider. But there's loads of questions building up for later on. Let's keep on playing through aircraft and airfields. Yeah, well,
this sort of runs into another thing I'm going to say later rather. Aircraft and airfields, their importance can't be overstated, but it wasn't the be all and end all to them, and I think this is where we're going to touch onto Allied unity earlier. I think one of the things that there was an air plan as Epsom was coming to an end. Churchill wrote to Tedder asking how many airfields and how many squadrons are actually based in Normandy. By the tail end of Epsom, there should have been in theory there should have been 80 squadrons based on the French side of the Channel. There were 35, and there were 13 full-time airstrips sorry, 13 full-time airstrips in Normandy itself. And on the face of it, you can't argue with Tedder. The air plan fell behind. You can blame it on the weather. You can blame it on lack of space within the bridgehead. But the fact of the matter is, it didn't make any difference. The air plan was, again, of all the things. This is probably one of my little hobby horses here. Of all the things that caused issues to the Allied effort in Normandy, at least. And this thing that Monty is accused of again and again is inflexibility. I think the airmen are certainly the higher ups, the likes of the Tedders and the Conynghams. Not so much Broadhurst, because I think he was a very pragmatic leader of Second Allied Tactical Air Force. But I think the airmen showed all of the characteristics that they accused Monty of. If it wasn't happening to according to the air plan, then you know that I mean, Tedder famously said that by the second or third week of Overlord, that due to the lack of aircraft based in Normandy, it had all the signs of a very dangerous situation. Well, if you'd have told that to the Germans, they'd have been very much surprised at that, you know, because they were getting hammered. Yeah, and yes, there's a certain amount of making excuses on the German side. Oh, we couldn't do that because the aircraft were everywhere. Yes, they were, but they weren't causing the issues that to the extent where they should have done. It wouldn't have affected the Wehrmacht of old to quite the same extent. So yes, everything was eventually spotted and strafed, or most things. The Panzer West, for example, their HQ was bombed to bits, wasn't it? By the 10th of June. So yes, it happened. So things like that happened, but it wasn't. Paucity of air support was never a thing for the Allies, and I think that is something that the Air Force chiefs, especially the British ones, couldn't get their heads around. Yes, aircraft were important. Monty admitted as much. Oh, we didn't even admit as much. He said it was vital. Tedder certainly flew the flag, and I don't think Tedder said it in a way that Tedder bad necessarily. He was very much obviously pro Air Force, because that was his whole reason d'etre. But when he made the trouble he made, I don't think initially he started out making trouble just for the sake of it. I think that he generally saw an issue and he wanted to address that issue. But as things developed, he was disproven more and more, and I think that's basically where I come from. There was an issue with aircraft being based on the other side of the channel, but you've got to bear in mind by the 8th of June, the first American aircraft were being based on behind Utah. A day or two later, the British had Spitfires and Typhoons based on the other side. I think Johnny Johnson said they were operating out of Normandy by the 8th, at least over during the day, and then flying back. So I don't think airfields ever were a real issue. Yes, they could have been more, and as the British did expand, then so did the amount of airfields. So I think it was one of those things that was made more of than possibly should have done. And that's
you're talking about the tactical advantage of having the air power normally, but David O'Keefe is mentioning the political whole thing about air power. I'm sure this is going to come up later on, Andrew, when we get to Goodwood and Blue Coat or whatever. But he's saying tactically, but certainly politically, airfields were extremely important because the failure to get the area south of Bavaria gave Ted ammunition for attacks on Monty. So there's been lots said about Montgomery that he ends up saying things that, because he's thinking about making sure he's got his joker of an air power to play later on. He's saying things, and this comes back to Goodwood. So there's clearly a political element. And as you said at the beginning, Tedder doesn't like Montgomery and Montgomery doesn't like Tedder. We could bring in Lee Mallory and some other people there as well. But what's your comment about the politics of air power in terms of Montgomery? Is Montgomery hamstrung by that to some extent?
He's hamstrung insofar as that Freddie, going back to old Freddie Gwingand, he says in his book, Operation Victory, he said that he was sure that the promises taken as promises by the airmen prior to the landings never were promises. He said that there's an interesting bit it's in some army problems, and it's in some other paperwork and orders. Monty says something along the lines of, as we get more ground, we get more aircraft, and things will improve, and that ground will come as soon as 21st Army Group can provide that ground. It's in other words, the airmen are trying to put words into Monty's mouth and the army's mouth generally, and then and Freddie's turned around, for example, and he says that he says that there are minutes to the meeting he's referring to, and I can't find those minutes. Probably someone who's more au fait with the way the RAF Museum keep their archives has probably found them, but I couldn't find them. I think, and he did say, that of all the early airfields, some are bound to have to be disused again, because they'll be too exposed to enemy fire, and that's exactly what did happen. But I think that politically, the air forces generally punched well above their weight. And if you think, this is opening a whole new can of worms, I know. But if you think of all the political capital that was tied up in the strategic bombing air assets, you can argue and I think it's an argument that carries weight that too much was given to the likes of Bomber Command, because let's face it, they were never going to use. They were never needed all those aircraft they were given. But once it was set in motion, like you said earlier about the tanks, as soon as it was set in motion, the X amount of aircraft needed to be given to Bomber Command. Then, by God, they're going to get those aircraft come hell or high water. And the likes of Harris and TUI spots as well in America. They were called the bomber barons for a reason, and if they didn't get the chance to use their aircraft, then they were going to want to know why. Harris was very scathing about panacea targets. He didn't think that his bomber command should be taken off him, as if it was his thing, bought and paid for, to use in Normandy in support of the army. I think there's a lot of people in the Air Force and in the civilian side of politics who were very keen to show that aircraft were going to play their part, and if they didn't, then it was almost a slight to them. And so I think that's partly where it comes from.
And just this, I'm going to try and keep this one quick. I mean, you're talking about the complications of the air power and all these other people involved there, and there's Bomber Harris and there's Doolittle and Spat, all these other guys there. Is that for some people, anything that they identify as being less than perfect with the Allied plan / doctrine in Normandy is automatically Montgomery's fault.
Yeah, it is.
Whereas in fact, there are a wider set of people involved in this, and he's not making every single decision on his own. It's this is the market garden thing all over again, isn't it? Yeah. Where Brereton and others and Browning seem to get off to some extent scot-free, and it all just gets put on his shoulders. But that is, as we said at the beginning, because Montgomery is the one who often does the briefings. He is the one who vocalizes what things are going to be. So therefore, he gets the tennis ball batted back into his face because he's the one who says it. So, I mean, do you think there are people guilty of accusing Montgomery for things that aren't really in his remit?
Absolutely. But Monty never helps himself, though, does he?
He just makes it worse by trying to, he's the stand-up comedian who puts down the heckle, but it doesn't work quite as well. He's not really good at putting down heckles. He
puts them down by shooting them, sort of thing.
It's a very blunt instrument. He's not clever with his. So it's. I mean, this is a fantastic conversation. The questions are building up for later on, but let's. We'll keep on moving, and we can always go back to things. So you hinted at Allied unity. We've hinted at it before. I mean, anyone who knows my channel knows that I think that the low point of the Allied operation was probably Operation Torch, and by 44 things are basically back to a fairly good point. But I want to hear what you want to say about this.
I mean, we talk about Allied unity as if it was only a thing at a local level, amongst the people at the sharp end, like between Monty and Patton and between Eisenhower and Allenbrook. But you think it goes further than that as well. I mean, to go slightly off kilter, there was still a bit of a hoo-ha, certainly from the British point of view, of the value of Anvil. Anvil was very much why are we bothering with this? You're just taking soldiers away from Italy. We could have used them. We could use them better. There was an operation Churchill was very keen on in the area of Trieste. To get there before he was thinking more of at that stage of the effect of the Russians on Europe as the war came to an end. So. Churchill, we were talking before we started this one about the way Churchill is being viewed. Churchill even offered to resign if it would help Roosevelt delay or even put Anvil on hold. But Roosevelt said, no, we've promised Joe Stalin that this is going to happen. So by goodness, it's going to happen. So Allied unity wasn't really. It was very much like that famous analogy of the swan, wasn't it? It seemed okay on the surface, but below it was paddling away madly. Everyone had their little hobby horses, and that's a major one, which very few people tend to think about. But likewise, and it goes back to what we spoke about earlier. The British Army, it has to be said, and to an even greater extent, probably the Canadian Army. were very much a wasting asset at this time, and a lot of the disunity was caused by, I think, the fact that the British Canadians stars were on the wane, and the Americans were coming into the fore, and they were what they said was going to go. And whether it be at Torch or Tehran or whatever, that was reflected, and it went back to events on the sharp end. So it's more about. I mean, unity was very much affected, especially at the end of Goodwood when there was that move to have Monty removed from overall command, which I think you can put that. It sounds like I've got a bit of a vendetta against Tedder, but I think Tedder was the chief cheerleader in all that. You know, so the unity was very much a thing that was taken for granted, but. I think there was a lot of people wanting to they wanted to win, but they wanted to win at almost any cost. And if that was going to break up the unity of the Allies, then they would have seen that as a worthy thing. I think I mentioned in my work a quote by a Lieutenant Colonel Cobra Smythe about the way that they viewed a coalition fighting in Afghanistan, and he said that basically leaders of a military coalition have got to remember that what they have in their hands is a political coalition as well, and that unity will have a strength all of its own and a value all of its own. And I think sometimes people at all levels tended to forget that, regardless of whether or not they were the Yanks come to the fore or the people like Brooke, who gave vent to his feelings behind the scenes, sort of thing. So I think it's. Go on.
I was going to say, I think it's also important to remember that Allied unity isn't like the electricity to your house. It isn't either on or off. There's not a switch saying it's a fluid, progressive thing. It's kind of like a marriage, isn't it? You can even over a simple dinner with your wife, you can say something that you wish you hadn't said, and you get a bad reaction. Then a minute later, you say something nice, and it's a conversation. I think. You know, as I think James Holland said this repeatedly, is that if you want to find all the crosswords exchanged between Montgomery and Bradley and so and so, you can find them. And if you want to find the nice things said, you can equally find them, because it's an ongoing relationship that changes certainly day by day and hour by hour. So Allied, and again, the other point I want to make is that however at times slightly fractured the Allied unity is, the Germans are all over the place. Their cracks are chasms at this point. So that no one completely throws their teddy out of the pram in the Allies, or their tedder out of the pram in the Allies. No one ever refuses point blank to work with anybody else. Well, at least not in Normandy. Whereas you get German generals sending their medals back with hate notes by the end of 44. So I think there's a lot of kind of breathe and just accept the fact that the Allied relationship is not it's humans interacting with each other. So it's never going to be 100%.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it seems to be when I was researching this, it seems to be indicative of the way human nature is, that the further away you get from Shafe, the less there is less disunity. The closer you get to Shafe, then you're like your Bedell Smiths and your Morgans and whatnot. They're busy stirring the pot, but the people at the sharp end or the sharper end. So the further away you get from Shafe, the more unity there is. The closer you get to it, the more disunity there is.
I think that's a fair point. Yeah. Right, let's move on. Epsom, Chambord, and Goodwood. The Goodwood's people are gonna sit up in their seats for this one. So over to you again.
Well, I think one of the things that Monty constantly said, and if not outright, then he alluded to, and a lot of times it was more than alluding to. So to Monty, the destruction of German forces was more important than the capture of ground per se.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say. I mean, if you look at Epsom and Goodwood, they are, I won't say entirely, but by and large, when people think of Epsom and Goodwood, they think of them as failures, because they didn't achieve what they wanted to do. Certainly with Goodwood, the three divisions going across the Orne in a trident shape. Really only 2 divisions got across, really, didn't they? And it should have lasted a lot longer, and it should have been in conjunction with Cobra, but Cobra didn't happen because Saint-Lô hadn't been taken yet. And I think from and this is something that Monty gets beaten over the head with. And this is where the confusion in the Caen, Cobra and confusion comes in. The way that Monty pitched Goodwood, especially, was we're going to set the front on fire. This is going to be, and that's the phrase he used. The front is going to be set on fire, and especially when we have other supporting operations and things that he was saying like Green Line and things, operations like that. We're going to set the on fire, and we're going to have all the and Eisenhower and Tedder jumps on, say, well, great, we'll give you all the air support you need, and then we'll flatten the Germans. You'll be able to roll out and then we'll be able to get to Paris by. It was, well, first of all, the breakout was never intended to come from the eastern part of the bridgehead at all. It was always going to be an American thing, but expectations were set miles too high. And Monty, to his credit, he did try and temper those expectations, but it's the way he used his wording to get what he wanted. And when it didn't happen, Tedder famously said that they were played for fools over Goodwood and the amount of air support.
Yeah.
That they want a ton of bombs per mile or something like that. I think Goodwood and Epsom were seen as failures, but they were not. They didn't. Yes, they didn't get the amount of ground expected, but I think people. They lost sight of the fact that for all the blood and treasure that was expended, they saw the lack of ground captured as a failure. And again, Monty got the brunt of that.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. If the ground had been taken, in Goodwood, if the concentric German defensive rings had been identified and dealt with properly, then he'd have taken the kudos. But it wasn't, capture of ground wasn't the point. And tank losses as well. Again, we're going back to Goodwood here. I'm going to get shot for this. I was watching Richard Holmes a few months ago with his battlefield walks, and he was going on. I say going on. That sounds awful. He was talking about Goodwood, and I think he quoted 500 tanks lost. It depends who you read, but it goes anywhere between 500 and 765 tanks lost, and as if that was the end of Eighth Corps. It wasn't. If you read the post-war REME after action reports, what it boils down to basically, and this might be a little on the low side, but total losses. They put down in the region of 156. Now, 156 compared to 156 doesn't sound quite so bad, and that's repaired and sent back, and that's the ones they couldn't repair. So everything else in that sliding scale of losses was either recovered on the day. Well, most of them they actually admit that they were recovered over the next few days. But most of the stuff that was abandoned because the crews didn't fancy hanging around, and that's not cowardice or anything like that. Because a disabled tank is a sitting target, so you are going to get a move on. But 156 doesn't sound quite as spectacular as 156, and I think that's some people to this day. I mean, the thing is regarding all these things, the information, Paul, that I quote and use, it's not hidden. It's there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is we're back to the sticks that Monty is beaten with, and as we've always said on this channel, I've said repeatedly, it's a German vehicle lost in July. It's gone. It's been knocked out. It's gone. It's an Allied vehicle knocked out, might be knocked out, but it might be dragged out of the way and repaired. It might be dragged out of the way and have bits taken off into use that the crew can be taken from that vehicle into a brand new one that's straight off the LCD. And so that all of these variables have to come into play. And I think you've also done a good job of reminding us you cannot take Goodwood in isolation. Goodwood is one of a series of league matches that are played across Normandy, including the battles for Cherbourg and everything. And it's the, as you say, the attritional effect is that there are then fewer German tanks involved in Spring and Atlantic and all of, and then by the time you get to the later operations, the Germans have got very little left. Whereas the Allies have been gradually building up this bigger and bigger army, and they can cope with these losses. So, yeah, it's paradoxically Goodwood can be a failure and a success at the same time, depending on your parameters.
Exactly. And the Remy report says they were able to get 70% of the tanks that they did recover back to their owners. In other words, the unit they came from within 48 hours. The Germans couldn't do that at all. As you said, once the tank was gone, it was gone. And by the time within 72 hours, all three divisions were back up to strength again, either because tanks had been recovered and sent back to them, or the tank parks had been empty. Well, they weren't emptied, were they? Never empty. But they went to the tank parks and replaced the ones that had been lost. And by the time you get to things like Cobra and Tractable and whatnot, there are streets ahead of the Germans. The Germans are literally down. That sounds awful. They were on their arses by then in a way that the Allies never were anywhere near that.
I mean, DKS said, so was the plan explicitly attritional? And I mean, it wasn't, was it? I mean, the plan, as you said, he did definitely mention taking ground. He did mention there was some quite good language there. And I'm gonna use a football analogy again because it came into my head. It would be like a manager of a team before a home and away legs of a Champions League game, saying our intention in the first leg is to win by maybe 1 goal, but make sure the other team, 2 or 3 of their players are injured, so that when we play the second match, they have got less players on the pitch. You'd never say that. You would say our plan is to win this 6-0. And I think we can't always say what Montgomery is saying in advance of something and take it too literally. Of course, it's back to Caen again. It's got to be aspirational. It's got to make people go, wow. You can't just go in as an opera and say, well, we're aiming to kind of attrit the Germans slightly and move our pawns a few yards across the chessboard. That's not how you deliver a briefing.
Not only that as well, but you're quite right. But also you've got to instill in the people that you're asking to be at the sharp end, whether they be British, Canadian, American, or whoever, that their sacrifice is worth it. You're not going to say, well, we've got plenty of tanks where they came from, so it's not, the tanks don't magically drive themselves. You've got 4 or 5 people in there. Your Firefly sacrifices 1 bloke to put more ammunition in it, but they're not like wind-up toys. You don't set them off across the Orne and then leave them to it. You've got to make sure that the sacrifices that those people are being asked to make actually mean something. You can't just say, this is not the First World War anymore, where I know it's a lazy truism saying lions led by donkeys. It wasn't quite as bad as that as the war progressed, but the spectre of Ypres and the spectre of the Somme still hung over the battlefield, especially for the British Canadians. If you're going to ask someone to do something, your life might be lost, but you're going to make sure that your sacrifice is going to be of some worth, and people forget that as well. And you've got to have. That's not to say you've got to be blindly optimistic. This is not OKH, and the signal reports. This is reality. But you can't say, well, we're going to lose probably half of these tanks, but it's okay. We've got plenty more where they came from.
Yeah, that would be a ridiculously insensitive thing to say.
Sorry, I would just say one thing I would say. People think of Goodwood as they used tanks because they had plenty of them. They didn't have so many blokes, which is true. But you think of the supporting operations like Green Line and whatnot. Yeah, the casualties there weren't exactly as a supporting operation. Green Line still incurred something like 2,500 casualties in that. Yeah. And that was just one of 3 or 4. So even the supporting operations were costly in human life.
Absolutely. Before we move on, you've got the hinge up there on the slide there, and that's one of the things that is highly contentious about exactly what the big broad plan is. And some people say this whole Caen and the eastern flank forming the hinge, so the Americans can do the kind of aggressive swinging up and then swinging down. Everybody moves off in a north-south line. Some people say that's a post-war construct. Some people say it's what Montgomery always intended and said he was going to intend. Without going down a massive 20-minute rabbit hole, the Hinge and Montgomery, what's your verdict?
It's funny, isn't it? I think Bradley at the time, he recognised that the British Canadians, their part in it was sacrificial. He actually said that in his memoirs. Harry Creer, head of the Canadians, he understood it well enough. There's a quote in my book if you're interested to find it. But he says more than once that it was understood from where he was coming from, that the whole point was to bring the German armour towards Caen, keep it fixed there, and let the Americans have, it's a relative phrase, an easier time of it. Let's not, I mean, in all this, let's not say the more tanks there were against the Canadians and the British, then the easier time that the Americans had, because that's certainly not the case. They weren't sat on their arses. Excuse my language. They were putting in the hard yards as well. But it was always Monty's intention, and I'll fight anyone about this, to bring the Germans over to Caen, so that when the time came, the Americans would have a relatively easier time of it.
Caen or a bit further south? David O'Keefe is saying Falaise.
Yeah, Falaise was was part of the orders from Goodwood. Get armored cars sweeping out towards Falaise. Oh, and again, that was a don't rest on your laurels. If you get past the initial areas that Goodwood sets down, then swipe out a bit further. So that was an aspiration. I don't think Monty ever really intended to get as far as Falaise via Goodwood. But I would argue till the day I die that sounds very dramatic.
You might be on people's hit lists after this. Who knows? There might be some very angry anti-Montgomery people thinking you're giving him far too crack.
I think the evidence speaks for itself. And I say all the things I say here, they're provable, because it's not. You don't have to go down to the deepest, darkest bits of the basement of Kew and Imperial War Museum and so on to find this information. It's there if you want to see it. It's there.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's move on. A few more slides and lots of questions building up. So, some Americans, the western flank, Saint-Lô and Cobra.
Well, I think, as you said earlier, I think Saint-Lô could be called the American Caen. It should have fallen a lot quicker, according to the plan. And I think what Eisenhower once said, that he thought that plans were useless, but planning was invaluable. And I think Saint-Lô was one of those things you could apply that to. Saint-Lô should have fallen a lot earlier than it did, but it didn't. That's because, and I think when we're talking about people beat Monty up with whichever brickbat they choose, I think people then and people now forget one thing. The plan, and Eisenhower in that respect, he was quite right. The plan will only work if the other side plays ball.
Yeah.
If the barrage wasn't a thing, for example, then there would have been no need for the Americans to go back to Utah and chop up beach obstacles and develop those rhinos to burst through them. And I don't understand it to a certain extent. And again, and this is something that maybe Monty should have been aware of. Right from back to Tunisia, when everyone seemed surprised that Adolf would reinforce Tunisia, when it was so obvious that North Africa was a lost cause, people seemed surprised that right up until the end of the war in Europe, that the Germans would fight so tenaciously, and even against the odds, even when it looked so obvious that the game was lost. And I think that's something that people forget then and now, that the Germans weren't going to make life easy for the Allies. And I think I'm amazed every time I hear criticism of any, because a lot of American historians aren't very kind to the Americans who fought on the western flank. They only had like Panzer Lehr, which was worn out, and the 17th Panzer Grenadier Division. And they weren't even a full Panzer Division, and still it took them a long time to do what they did. Well, okay, fair enough, you can say that, but you weren't there. and the Germans fought like things possessed. And I'm not saying
I think Panzer Lehr are underappreciated. I think they
oh, God,
all
yes.
the German divisions, they knew how to hold the ground. They would try and resist all of Hitler's encouragement to do or die stupid counterattacks. They would kind of just fall back to another prepared position and let the Allies come on to them. And I think a few more people of Fritz Beyerlin's competence. I'm not saying he's perfect. And I think the Germans could have held on to Normandy a little bit longer. I think the Panzer Lehr model was clearly the one that was showing far more merit than the stupid 12 SS, let's leap in our vehicles and charge towards the coast until we all die methodology, which was clearly ridiculous.
Well, I think that makes a difference that Lehr was made up of demonstration units to start off with, as opposed to the young lads who couldn't even have their drinks ration, so they got extra sweets. So youth tends to be a bit more reckless, even by German standards. So as you say, they all their leaders got wiped out fairly early on. Panzer Lehr didn't. I mean, by the end of Sanlo and Cobra, Panzer Lehr, they were done. They were a shadow of their former selves, and they never really came back from that. By the time of the fall, they were gone. They were a done deal. But I think Sanlo was a hard learning curve for the Americans. I'm probably going to get shot again here. I'm amazed at the way that the Americans seemed to view plans and planning even before Normandy. I thank God that the British were able to put them off doing things like sledgehammer or ranking, because they would have been chopped up and eaten for breakfast. It would have made Dieppe look like a tea party. I think the fact that the likes of Marshall wanted to get across the channel as soon as to get rid of throw the Germans out of France. That if ever there was anything was aspirational, that was it. But there was a reason why torch was so important, and that was to cut the teeth of the Americans. I mean, Kasserine is a massively overrated defeat, tactical defeat for the Americans. But it was telling that even at that stage of the game, Rommel was able to turn around and give them a bloody nose to the extent he did. That would have been magnified so many times prior to Normandy. So I think that even as late as Saint-Lô, the Americans were still learning in a way that the Americans, in a way that the British Canadians were slightly ahead of them in that game. But certainly from Saint-Lô onwards, you couldn't hold a candle to the American forces. They'd learned their lessons, and that showed in things like Cobra. And so
which brings us to Cobra, and I'm a massive fan of particularly the Western flank and the 8th Corps pushing down in Middleton. And, as you said, that Saint-Lô was a necessary evil. It was a learning curve. I mean, you could argue the same thing for the British fighting around Caen for 6 weeks, 2 months, is that they learned lessons there. They'd already learned some in North Africa and Tunisia, but they learned more about pushing on South the Canadians too. And, ultimately the whole of the war is a continual learning curve. And it's about just keeping yourself moving forwards on a line towards a never achievable perfection, whereas the Germans just don't have any real new thinking to throw into anything after about 1943, in my opinion.
Well, you've hit the head on it. You've stolen my thunder a little bit there. And in the way that the myth of the Germans, they, as you just said, they were very much one-trick ponies from sort of like 1943 onwards. They had nothing new to offer. In a way that the British, Canadian, and the Americans they learned and they kept on, whether it be the Kangaroos using those to support the infantry, or the way that they utilised forward air controllers, and again that was done differently between the Americans and the British. But the point is, it still worked. Yeah, and so the Allies learned, and the Germans didn't. That's basically in a nutshell. Even allowing for the things they had to deal with under Adolf, So.
Yeah, but as you got on the slide there, as things look a little bit easier come July, and the breakout is sort of on the cards now, and things are, the instability, the attritional phase, as James Holland calls it, is sort of coming to an end. Do you think it's already in July 1944? In some ways, the post-war narrative is starting to come into place. There's already a way of looking at the recent past in a slightly different way than how it had been appreciated even just weeks earlier.
I think people were. I think you can see a change from the tail end of July to roughly the time of Falaise, where things like unit records were worded, and orders from on high filtering low. I think even by that stage, some people had an eye to the official histories that we written post-war.
Right.
I think so. Yeah. To answer your question, yeah, I think definitely you can see there is even at that early point, even before the Germans were defeated or even pushed out of France altogether, you can see a change in the narrative, which was going to be picked up on as the conflict developed and the war came to an end, and certainly post-war, especially early on. Part of the thing I think that I think the thing that you got to bear, well, I keep saying that, the thing you got to bear in mind, a lot of especially the early post-war accounts of the battle were written when the people themselves were still alive. So it's no good saying that, General Bloggs was no bloody good, when General Bloggs was alive and well, to say,
and doing his memoir, why he may mention you.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Monty didn't bother about that, that's famous.
No, he didn't give a shit, did he? Yeah.
So but I don't even think it was a question of Monty not caring. I think Monty saw a thing and he said it regardless of, I mean, you go back to his famous gaffe post Bulge. He didn't. What he actually said, he didn't say. Yeah, he did say it. I'm not going to say he didn't, but he didn't say it in quite the way it came out, and he certainly didn't intend it to come out. But the way it came out, of course, is what the Americans are in trouble, and I came and I saved the day, and blah blah blah.
That's exactly how it comes across. I mean, he clearly didn't quite mean it in that way. No, and another person might have said, "Oh, sorry, can I just say that again? What I meant was."
And I think that goes back to my point. At that time, Freddie was himself. He was fighting his own health problems. So I think that Monty, even though he would have hated to have been considered as such, he did need the help of other people. But whether or not he took that help or recognised he had to take that help is
good point.
So
Well, we'll move on, keep on moving, because we said we've got these questions building up, and I think we hinted at this right at the beginning. Is just what was meant by everybody at all points and the language. So I'll let you handle why you put this slide up there.
Well, I think basically in a nutshell, and again, if you want to go into further in this, it's in my book, No Refunds. The two sides, they were separated by the use of language, and I think nowhere is that more clear than the way that Thunderclap, as it was presented, and the orders given as the campaign developed. You can see that happening again and again and again. What was crystal clear to the British and Canadians, I say, remind you again of Courier's. The way he viewed the orders and the way the campaign mapped out compared to the way the Americans thought. They think it was just they were not. Oh, can you just bear with me 1 second, mate? Could you just put us on hold or something? 1 second.
Yeah, no worries. I'll carry on talking, folks. So, this is a fantastic conversation. I'm really enjoying this. And folks, we've got another one where we're going to go back into this same sort of conversation tomorrow with Phil McCarthy talking about brigadiers in the British Army in the Normandy campaign. So while we're just waiting for Andrew, just don't forget, folks, that you can always click like and subscribe. Consider becoming a channel member. In fact, I'll put a banner up of the people who've signed up recently. This is a great conversation. I'm really enjoying it, and we're never going to get any definitive opinions about this stuff. But it looks like we've got Andrew back there. We're back. Here we are. Yep. Hang on.
So sorry about those sons and children. God
no worries, no problem at all. So, where were we?
So, use of language. I think effectively language divided the Allies as much as the Germans did on many occasions, and I think you can see that. I mean, that played for fools. That's a a quote from Tedder. But I think language. Also, language within many of the things that affect Monty happened off the battlefield, and many things that happen off the battlefield happen in the world of the written word, whether that be stuff generated by universities in academia or by the likes of Stephen Ambrose and whatnot. I think what is crystal clear to one side is not crystal clear to another. What Monty thought he'd said, people couldn't understand the true importance of his words. I mean, to me, I don't understand why it ever came to pass that things like Goodwood transferred in Eisenhower's head, that from Goodwood, then the British and Canadians would charge off to the Seine and Paris, when that was never the issue at all. The breakout was never going to be from the British Canadian point, and why people like Morgan stoked that particular fire. I think a lot of stuff was said for short-term gain at the time and later, and I think also it's because many books were written with an audience in mind, regardless of whether or not it was. I wouldn't say true or not, because I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that historians lied. I wouldn't ever suggest that, but they know the way to pitch it, whether it be the author themselves or the publisher, the publishers. And I think a lot of stuff started to disappear down a very negative nationalistic rabbit hole at one stage, and I think that's reflected in the way that Monty and other people were portrayed post-war.
And I think it's probably fair to say that none of the key players thought that we would all be still discussing it with such fervor 80 years later. They would have thought that something else would have happened that would have taken their interest. But World War II has still become, or is still, this massive, great subject for debate, and that people would be poring over every single thing they said, and there would be a social media age, and there'd be forums, and there'd be debates, and there'd be all this ability to use their words back against them, and immediately pull up quotes and say, but you said this on May the 3rd, you said this, and then in July. It's a fascinating era.
I think to close this particular thing, I think that if Monty had by D+6-7, I think if Monty would have turned around to, figuratively speaking, to Eisenhower and Tedder and said, look, clearly we're not going to get to Caen. It's not going to happen, but taken en masse, it will still serve the wider purpose, and then to basically reiterate what I think he always meant in the thunderclap things. If he'd have said that, I'm not saying Tedder would have become automatically his best buddy, because I don't think that would have ever happened. But if he'd have said that and laid it out, then he would have saved an awful lot of hassle, whether it be reputational or otherwise further on down the line. And I think he was arrogant enough to think that he'd explained himself well enough to start off with, and if people don't understand the plan, well, that's just too bad from their part. But if he'd have just had the nous to as I say, from D6-7 to explain what was going to happen there on in, I think many of the bullets that they used against him would have been cast aside. But that's Monty.
Absolutely. Got a couple of what ifs, then we'll get to these questions.
What is I as a rule, I don't really like what ifs, but what if Caen had been taken on D+1-2? What would have happened? I think they'd been repulsed. I think I honestly do. I think that 3rd British Infantry Division, if not, I won't say they'd be wiped out, but they'd have been given a bloody nose and they'd been pushed back again. I think it would have been bad news for First Corps. Let's see that greater better tank country was taken to start earlier on. Would it have gone better for the Allies? Probably not, because regardless of whether or not there were only a finite amount of German Panthers and Tigers and whatnot, the truth is that at killing distances, we didn't have as many tanks capable of taking on things like Tigers, Panthers, even the humble Stug. That's a very hard target to hit, so low down. So I'm not saying that Caen would have we would have lost the battle. It would have just taken them longer. So what if
it would have essentially what you were saying? It would have been a Pyrrhic victory. We'd have got Caen, but it would actually come back to bite us on the arse.
Yes,
and I think that was we had that question earlier from Jim who asked about where is it? I find it here. Even if Caen's take on D-Day, would there have been sufficient forces to withstand inevitable counterattacks? And basically, you're saying no.
No, there wouldn't have been. There wouldn't have been. I mean, it would have that would have been the high points for the Germans, you know. But it wouldn't have led to the roll up of the bridgehead at all. It would just taken, you know. In fact, I'm not even saying that it would have taken longer than 3 months. I mean, Monty still managed to turf the Germans out of France as far as the Seine. You know, is it 12 with 12 days to spare? Yeah. I think he'd have probably still have done it. But it wouldn't have been ahead of schedule. But yeah, I think that's the major what if. Yeah. What if Cherbourg would have been taken earlier? Would it have made any difference? Yeah. I don't think so, because it was well and truly wrecked by that time. You know, wouldn't it have made any difference if Saint Malo was taken be a beach? Maybe, maybe not. You know, it's just there are. I think Caen is the biggest what if. Would it have made any difference if taken? And the answer to that is yes, but not in a good way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, we'll deal with some of these comments and questions. David O'Keefe just kind of said what you said there. Yes, would have had to get to Verrières. Well done for mentioning Verrières again. And consolidated by the end of D-Day, there was certainly something considered, but in hindsight now looks like an extremely tall order. So we'll go through these. They refer to things you were saying earlier and later on. So this is just a comment here from Jim. Seems to me Monty was a soldier's general that cared about his men, but didn't get along well with his peers. That's what we said. That I agree with that 100%. I think you do too, Andrew. Yeah.
I mean, he famously, before D-Day, he went to inspect the Welsh Guards, and he asked one of the guardsmen what was his most important part of, most important thing to him, to the Welsh Guardsman, and he said, "My rifle, sir." And he said, "No, it's your life, and I'm going to save it for you." And I think that illustrates, you know, I mean, a good general must know in their heart of hearts that a certain proportion of his men are going to be lost. But I think it was important to Monty to win with the least possible casualties, and I think that's why I said that basically every man that fought for Monty was one of Monty's men, whichever nation. So yeah,
you said that. So we'll try and do these questions kind of like 1 or 2 sentence response. Otherwise, we'll be here all evening. Ian Carr is saying how much of the controversy goes away if his autobiography is ignored, and I think that's about if he had been sitting next to Patton in the car that crashed in 1945, I don't think we'd be having half these conversations. He you know, it was his own. We can't deny his arrogance after war. I mean, his memoirs are a little bit self-serving, and so if he doesn't do an autobiography, is the controversy there?
Possibly not. And also, if Market Garden hadn't happened, because
true.
I think if Market Garden affected him as much as Normandy, so that's the.
Okay, thank you. David O'Keefe again is saying you're absolutely right. Montgomery was a student of the last 100 days of World War I. It was a concept of bite and hold all the way. That's going back to earlier on. So thank you for that. One from Jimmy: is it fair to say that the overall Allied strategy of the Normandy campaign was achieved? Brits held German armor on the left, while Americans turned the right flank. I mean, we've kind of been discussing that as we go along, but he kind of does do what he said. He said he would do, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say he does that, and I think it's important to bear in mind as well that both the Americans and the British and Canadians, they achieved great things. They outshone. If you want to talk about land ground captured, they both wiped the floor with the Ghost Division of Rommel's heyday in France. They when push came to shove, they did everything they said they were going to do, and they did it ahead of schedule as well. So yeah, I think
absolutely. Thank you. We'll go back. We're playing through these. We've hardly mentioned Miles Dempsey today. I mean, again, that would be a subject for a different book, a different presentation, essentially. But this comes back to what we were saying earlier about people putting everything on Montgomery's shoulders when there's actually a wider cast of people. Miles Dempsey, I think Ian chose a good word, enigma there. He doesn't really say much, does he, Dempsey, at any point? But he's clearly a big figure in this, isn't he?
He's a very big figure, and I think that the risk of the thing to be about with Dempsey is Epsom was very much Dempsey's plan, and it wasn't a very good one, I don't think. But he learned his lesson, and so as in common with many other people. So I think he was happy to stay in the background, and he learned his lesson in a way that many other generals failed to do so. So
okay,
yeah,
thank you. So Jim asked about, was Monty criticized for building up too high attack ratio, therefore wasting time? This kind of just springboards of what you just said about caring about his lives, is that, and this is the cautious label, isn't it? Is that maybe he can be criticized for building up too big of a force. He balances it more in the risk than the reward. What's your assessment in that? Again, not going too long in an answer.
I think it's answered best by a Monty quote. He says, "I use the forces needed to achieve the required result." And I think in Monty's head, he did that. So he attacked with what he needed in his view. So.
Thank you. There's a comment from John Craig. Hi, Woody. The battles before Caen, I think, were the most brutal of the war, as the weaponry on both sides were deadly. Air power was possibly the clincher of victory. Monty was the best commander. So there are clearly some people who like Montgomery. There hasn't been much Montgomery bashing in the sidebar. Whether they're waiting to, they're typing out big, huge, long response they're going to post later on, I don't know. Rob Crane makes the good point. I think you kind of alluded to this. Is I do wonder how much of the he didn't get Caen stems retrospectively after Market Garden.
A lot of it. I think Monty was one of the, I was thinking about this. I don't think we should treat this as a party show. I was thinking that Monty, in some respects, he always reminds me of. He was like a bit of a magpie. He was attracted to shiny new ideas. And I think he could be not bamboozled, but I think he'd be blinded by people who proselytize about new things. I think he was taken in, for example, by the use of airborne forces in Market Garden, and much was promised, and he didn't fully appreciate the drawbacks of surprise, and surprise was thrown away in Market Garden as well. So I think Market Garden affected his reputation in Normandy as well.
Okay, this one this will blindside. This one stems from a conversation we had on an Ask Me Anything a few weeks ago from Jamie Lundy, who was my last guest on Friday in a cracking presentation about his grandfather. What does Andrew think Monty's favorite cake or biscuit would be? This came up in the conversation. You can come back and have a think about that one while you're answering the next questions. But I think he would have felt for something quite dull. I think he's kind of a rich tea biscuit. I don't think he's anything exotic like a pink wafer, but you can have a think about that unless you've got an immediate response that comes straight to mind.
I do, as it happens. I always think, I don't know why I was doing this. I think Monty was probably a Garibaldi person.
Oh, see, that came up, a Garibaldi person. Okay, dead fly biscuit. Okay, well, there we are. You heard it here, folks. Here first. Andrew Harrison says his favorite biscuit would be a Garibaldi. There we go. Another one from Gary August there. What lessons does Andrew think will learn, if any, moving forward in the Battle of Normandy and beyond? So is there a fundamental thing that Montgomery takes on board, that he takes forward, or indeed something he should have taken on board?
I think lessons learned should have been either go for, I think... How can I say it? Yeah, he should have knocked Market Garden on the head and gone for the opening up of the approaches to the Scheldt. He should have opened up Antwerp. That's what he should have done. So I think he lost sight of the need for logistics, which was a strange thing to say for Monty, because I think he was fully aware of the need for logistics, but I think he lost sight. He took his eye off the ball there. He should have gone for the opening of the clearing of the Scheldt to get Antwerp up and running.
I think you'll get a lot of agreement there from the viewers there, because we did our Scheldt estuary series last year, which was pretty good. So a couple more points. We've nearly done them all now. And David, I gave you kind of a comment. Really, it came down to an argument between a trit to maneuver and a maneuver to a trit. How do you achieve a breakout? So there are these considerations that Montgomery is having to kind of consider. Of course, you consider consideration. It was a crap sentence, Woody. I do apologize for the crassness of that one. But there are a lot of things going on in June and July that he has to balance. As you said earlier about, are you trying to attrit the enemy? Are you trying to liberate French peoples? Or are you trying to gain ground? And those three are not necessarily in alignment. So there's a lot going on about the wider campaign. do you think he basically had it right in terms of how to achieve that breakout?
I think so. In a nutshell, I think he had, even though the Americans were going to be the stronger coalition partner by the end of Normandy, the British Canadians couldn't have been thrown away. They still had a part to play as the wider campaign to liberate Northwest Europe happened. So I think he had to guard the fighting strength of the British Canadians while supporting his, I'll put superior in numbers at least, American colleagues. So yeah, I think he had to always be mindful.
Yeah. And referring to your comment about the language, I mean, David O'Keefe added this, and thank you very much for your contributions, Mr. O'Keefe. That's why you put secondary sources aside and go back to the primary sources, which is what you've been saying to us all evening. You can see the type of misunderstandings unfolding in correspondence between Eisen and Monty. I mean, I used the example before we went live, folks, about when an American says something is quite good, they mean it is very good, whereas a British person is saying something is quite good, it can mean it's actually not very good at all. Well, that meal was quite good. And these little, it's not the words that are completely different. It's not, I don't know, pavement and sidewalk where we use a completely different word. It's the ones where we use the same word, but we use it slightly differently. And I think even today, when you look at some of Eisenhower's letters and the correspondence on Montgomery, a Brit would read the same sentence differently to an American, and a Canadian might read it with a third interpretation. And that's a modern British or Canadian or American, and language has evolved several times since the war, which brings us back to that original point about there'll never be a definitive understanding of all this because it is open to interpretation, isn't it? The language used, it will still always be, well, what did he really mean by that?
I think, yeah, I think that's it's made harder. I think Eisenhower's life was made harder by Monty. There's no two ways about that. You would be hard pressed to find a more understanding Supreme Commander facing someone like Montgomery, which is why I think that really, I mean, if you think that if Alexander had been put in charge of the ground forces instead of Montgomery, I think he'd have done a decent enough job. But I think he was too much of a people pleaser in a way that Monty wasn't. So I think the job would still have been done, but I think Monty did it more effectively than Alexander would have done.
Okay. Well, that will lead to this will be the final question we'll do, because we have been at this for an hour and a half, over an hour and a half. When people say Montgomery was not the right person to lead 21st Army Group, when I get that question, I always say, well, who would have been? And I hate it when a Brit will say General Slim, because I have this. Why would you take Slim away from Burma and India, where he is absolutely perfectly suited to that with his language ability, his understanding of the constraints and disadvantages and advantages that can be? Why would you take him out of that? You know, it's like taking a manager away from a cricket team to manage a football team. What's the point? But is there anybody in your research for this book? Is there anyone? You said that Alexander was too much for people person. Is there anyone else you genuinely could think would have been a viable candidate to do what Montgomery did?
Certainly not from the British side of things. Maybe, and this is a big maybe, Alan Brooke, because might have been better than. But I think by that time Alan Brooke had been too far out of the general day to day. I think Alan Brooke was perfect for what he did, but I don't think he'd have been that good as a ground force commander. I think you're right with Slim. Slim was perfect for what he was. He was very much the right horse for the right course. I don't think he'd have been. His legacy would have been improved at all by being put into Normandy.
I mean, he couldn't have possibly done better than he did in Burma, really. I mean, okay, it was a slightly tricky start, but anybody taking over the Burma campaign at the beginning was going to be facing an uphill struggle. But how he manages everything from sort of, the end of was outstanding. And we've done shows about that on the past. But Eichelberger has come in. O'Connor from David O'Keefe there.
No.
Grant Dunn says, does Andrew look in his t-shirt wish it could be Christmas every day? Clearly, yes, you do. If I've gone for a band, the t-shirt, I've gone for my Hillbilly Moon Explosion Swiss Rockabilly t-shirt today. But anyway, the thing about this is we haven't sorted this out tonight. We haven't sorted it out with your book. There'll be books about Montgomery, Normandy, Goodwood for the next, as long as people are talking about World War II. And it does come down to people's opinions. So I'm hoping, folks, if you have gone into this with the same opinion about Montgomery, explain in the comments afterwards why you still think the same. If you came into this not liking Montgomery, have you given room for thought? Has anything that's been said today, either by Andrew or in the sidebar, given you food for thought? I would love to hear your comments after in this. I feel it could go on. It could be a really good discussion. But Andrew, it's been fantastic talking to you. What's next? Are you going to tackle another control? Are you going to do Market Garden and really piss people off?
I think Market Garden's been done to death, to be honest with you. I'm looking at something with an Australian writing partner about the role of British people who fought for the Australian Army during Vietnam. So that's a source. It's a completely different part of the thing. I did write a few years ago a book which was supposed to be part of a trilogy about the French in Indochina, and so far it's a trilogy of one. So I'd like to go back at some stage, but that's where I am with. I haven't got anything in Second World War related to my shoulder.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's hope you haven't got anyone's hit list, as you keep saying. You said to something, I hope I don't get shot from this. But yeah, so people have opinions about this, and there we are. So people are saying brilliant discussion, stellar presentation. It certainly kept me amused and smiling. And Andrew's assessment, it's hard to disagree with anything you've said, which is fantastic. And there we are. So folks, back again tomorrow with Phil McCarthy talking about Brigadiers. More stuff coming your way, as I said earlier. Click like and subscribe. In the meantime, this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Monday. Cheers, Andrew. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you.